Welcome to the Word at Work. This is a series on the Old Testament book of Kings. We're up to episode number 7. My name is Nathan Lovell. Today we're in 1 Kings chapter 12. We'll be looking at verses 1 to 24. Israel's greatest of kings, King Solomon, you'll remember, has died. Solomon's son Rehoboam is about to take over the kingdom from his father, but we know that God has other ideas for it. In response to Solomon's sin, God had sent a prophet to Jeroboam, one of Solomon's managers, and told him that he would have 9/10 of the kingdom and it would be taken away from Solomon's son. But Rehoboam is not just going to give it away. Let's see what happens. As usual, you'll get more out of this talk if you pause the video and have a look at 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 to 24. I'll see you soon. Well, I wonder what sort of person it would take to be a good king in God's kingdom. What do you think of when you think of a good king, or a good leader for that matter? What kind of person? Do you want somebody wise? Do you want someone with integrity? Do you want someone impressive? Somebody that people can really get behind, a visionary who will set the direction and we'll all follow them? Do they need to be trustworthy, do you think? Do you want someone who can get the job done and lead by example? It'll just be someone who we respect and follow, right? In this series so far, of course, we've been looking at Solomon as king for God's kingdom. In many ways, he was an ideal king. He was all of those things. Rich, powerful, successful, a visionary, somebody who got things done, someone who built an entire kingdom, an empire for himself. But they weren't enough. And as we saw, his kingdom had fallen apart because Deuteronomy reminded us that God's king should not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and not turn from the law, either to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. That's Deuteronomy 17. So after the kingdom fell apart, we met a chap named Jeroboam. Again, confusing here. Jeroboam, not the king's son, just the taskmaster, the manager guy. Rehoboam, the king's son, Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Don't get them mixed up, otherwise this will be very confusing for you. Well, it turns out that Solomon's kingdom had some internal divisions to go along with some of its external struggles. Tell me, if you're Rehoboam and your dad has just died and left the kingdom to you, where do you hold your coronation ceremony? Where do you go to get crowned? It's not that tricky a question, right? Think about it. Where's the temple? Where's the palace? Where's the center of Israelite life in Solomon's kingdom? You go somewhere to Jerusalem, right? But very confusingly, this story opens somewhere else. Rehoboam went to Shechem, where all Israel had gathered to make him king. Why? Where is Shechem? It's a bit like, it's a bit like the president-elect of South Africa getting inaugurated in Hermanus or something. It's just a very odd choice. Shechem is one of the cities in the northern part of Solomon's kingdom, and the reason he's gone there is because it turns out he doesn't really have the support of all the people in the kingdom. He has the support of Judah, where Jerusalem is. But the northern tribes didn't actually like Solomon all that much. And we only find that out now, after the fact. We didn't read about that in the first part of the book. All the people come to Shechem, and they are willing to let Rehoboam be king. But they have some conditions. Your father made our burdens very heavy. Now, this is the problem with big golden kingdoms, isn't it? Somebody has to dig all the gold out of the ground. It's fine if you're the Queen of Sheba who comes and stands and you're all impressed at the throne and you think, wow, how lucky your servants must be. But if you're one of the servants who's got to go and dig the gold out of the ground, then maybe you feel differently about this kingdom that Solomon has built. There have actually been some little hints all the way through the book that perhaps Solomon hasn't treated all of the different parts of his kingdom equally. Back in chapter 4, maybe you'll remember it talked about the way he taxed different parts of his kingdom. He divided it up into different regions, and each region gave him taxes for 1 month a year. But if you read it closely, you'll notice that Judah is not one of the regions. So it looks like Judah is exempt from tax under Solomon's taxation system, while everybody else pays for the kingdom. In 1 Kings 5, we read just a tiny little note about the way Solomon had gathered all the forced labor from Israel so that he could construct the temple. And now Solomon's gone, and here are the Israelites who Solomon has used to get rich and to build this glorious kingdom. They come to Rehoboam and they say, well, look, you want to be king? Fine. Make life easier for us. Your father made our burden very heavy. Lighten it from us and we will serve you. Perfectly reasonable. Rehoboam says, all right, I want to think about it, go away for 3 days, come back to me in 3 days' time and we'll talk then. And so they do. And Rehoboam calls his advisors and he gets 2 different pieces of advice. And it comes down to this question. What sort of kingdom does Rehoboam want to build? We've seen what sort of kingdom Solomon wanted to build. What kind of man will Rehoboam be? What kind of kingdom will Rehoboam's kingdom be? Imagine being him for a minute. Imagine being Solomon's son and growing up in the shadow of that great, wise and admired leader. What must have life been like for Rehoboam? One of the most intelligent, rich, successful, prosperous, spectacular kings for a father that ever lived. And you know you're next in line. What kind of daddy issues must have Rehoboam had? So Solomon's old advisors come to Rehoboam and they say, you know what, Rehoboam, you're not really Solomon, are you? Solomon, he could get away with it. But these people, they're not going to work for you the same way they work for Solomon. Why don't you just give them what they ask for? Lower their load, lighten their burden, and they'll serve you. That's their advice. But the younger guys who don't know Solomon all that well, who grew up with Rehoboam, give him the opposite advice. And they come to him and they say, what do you mean lighten their loads? Don't you want to be a king like your dad was? No, don't you want to be a better king than your dad was? What do you want your kingdom to be remembered for? Do you want to be remembered as the guy who let the kingdom go downhill into nothing? Is that what you want? No, you've got to be more impressive than your dad. You've got to take what he did and build on it and make it even better. And they provoke Solomon and they say, why don't you say this to the guys? Say to them, my little finger is bigger than my father's thigh, except that your Bible's being a little bit polite. They don't actually say little finger. They say, go and tell them my little thing, you can use your imagination, is bigger than my father's whole thigh is. In other words, I'm 10 times the man my father was. What sort of kingdom do you want, Rehoboam? What sort of man are you? Do you have what it takes? Are you man enough to rule this kingdom? That's what they're saying to him. So Rehoboam calls the people back 3 days later. And amongst them, when they come back, just happens to be Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam had been in Egypt, you'll recall, because Solomon tried to kill him. Solomon knew he was a contender for the throne. But now Solomon's gone, so Rehoboam has come back. And he's part of the crowd that comes and gathers around Solomon. This is the guy that God promised the kingdom to, you'll recall from the previous episode. Rehoboam steps up and he chooses the worst possible words. He doesn't actually say the thing about the little finger, but he chooses the worst possible words that he could have possibly picked on this occasion. He tells the men in verse 14, my father laid heavy burdens on you, but I'm going to make them even heavier. My father beat you with whips, but I will beat you with scorpions. Talk about adding gasoline to the fire. I don't know what he expected, to be honest. What did he think was going to happen when he said that? Of course, exactly what you think is going to happen happens. Verse 16. When all Israel realized that the king had refused to listen to them, they responded, down with the dynasty of David. We have no interest in the son of Jesse. Back to your homes, O Israel. Look out for your own house, O David. And so the people of Israel returned home. Down with the dynasty of David? What part do we have with David? We don't want anything to do with you. We don't want anything to do with your kingship. Notice we don't want anything to do with the promises that God has made to David's offspring. Down with David. We're going to make our own kingdoms. Of course, Rehoboam doesn't just let that stand. He tries to get them back. He sends a taskmaster to rein in the people and they stone him to death. And in the end, Rehoboam has to get in his chariot and run back to Jerusalem where he's safe because they're going to kill Rehoboam as well. It looks like the most spectacular of failures. Here's the grandson of David. With all of the expectations that we have about a righteous king who will come and sit on David's throne, here it is, and the kingdom is literally tearing itself apart. And right in the middle of it, there's this one really interesting verse that reminds us that even so, God hadn't failed in this. Verse 15, the king paid no attention to the people, but this turn of events was the will of the Lord. For it fulfilled the Lord's message to Jeroboam the son of Nebat through the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh. And we're reminded, aren't we, that God, even in the midst of this chaos, God is actually still doing exactly what he said he would do. And this is so important. It doesn't look like this is going to be good for God's kingdom. It doesn't look like progress in any way. It looks like things are falling apart. And it doesn't even look like God will be able anymore to fulfill the promise to David. What do we care about the dynasty of David? Look to your own people. And they go. But this is exactly what God said would happen. God told Solomon that if he didn't keep God's word, and he didn't, then God would tear the kingdom away. And God told Jeroboam that he would give Jeroboam a chance to be a king like David. And here we are. Jeroboam will be the next king of 9/10 of this people. We're going to think a lot about the way God does what he says he will do. We're going to do that in the next episode, though. For now, let's close by thinking about that question we started with. What kind of king would actually be good for building God's kingdom? What kind of king will be a good king of God's kingdom? If not someone like Solomon, well, certainly not someone like Rehoboam. We don't know about Jeroboam yet, but it's not going to be him either. Spoiler warning. But perhaps Rehoboam's advisors said it best. Have a look at verse 7. The older counselors replied, "If you are willing to be a servant to this people today and give them a favourable answer, then they will always be your loyal servants." If you're willing to be a servant king. That's actually the sort of king that God's kingdom needs. That's the kind of king we read about in Deuteronomy 17, someone who doesn't consider himself better than all of his brothers. Someone who's not ashamed to call us brothers. Someone who doesn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. I wonder where God's people will find a king like that. That's it for this episode. I'll see you again next time. We'll be looking at what Jeroboam does with his chance at the kingdom. There's a strange story. It's got donkeys, it's got lions that don't eat donkeys but do kill people. If you want to read ahead, have a look from where we got up to in chapter 12 through to the end of chapter 13. I'll see you then.